So here's a new series for this channel. The game goes like this. I identify a trope in metal songwriting and give a bunch of examples that I like. Then you all throw as many other examples of the same thing into the comments as you can. If you get a good one, I'll put it in the pinned comment with credit to whoever suggests it. So who's ready to play Metal Tropes? This week we're talking about none other than the thing where you get the same riff coming back but slower. It seems like maybe originally it's a Doom thing. Here's one of the clearest Doom examples I could find from Conan's Thunderhoof. Near the end of the song we get this riff that's already pretty slow and nasty. And then a little bit later, it comes back even slower and nastier. But it's definitely not just a Doom thing. Here's one of the clearest examples I could find from the Beast of Nod's aptly named the cybernetic tiger with a dorsal mounted laser cannon. We get this riff. She'll just kill you, she'll blow off your legs, and she'll claw out your eyes, she'll rip out your guts. Then after a quick pause, we get it again, but slower. She'll just kill you, she'll blow off your legs, and she'll claw out your eyes, Then another pause, and you guessed it, even slower. Here's another tech death one from Archspire's Relentless Mutation, where the original version of this riff goes straight into the slower one. Super nasty. Let's just keep blasting through examples. Here's one from more mainstream or proggy or groovy metal from Gojira's Explosia. The second riff of the song is this thing that sounds like it's a phasing polymeter type thing, but it's not. Then at the end of the song, we get this same riff, but at 2/3 of the original tempo. Staying in progland, one of the most extensive examples of this thing happens over the course of the Ocean's Pelagic, which might be one of the most thorough concept albums I've heard. There are a lot of motives that get transformed to lower and slower versions over the course of the album, which uses a journey from the surface to the floor of the ocean as a metaphor for a journey into the subconscious. I'll probably do a video about this whole album someday, but for a quick example, here are some riffs from the last track, Benthic. We start with this rhythmic motive. Then it gets a little slower after a pause. Then it gets slower yet again. been too long since I listened to that album. It's such a trip. Moving on into Mathcore territory. Here's one I really like from Ithaca's Youth versus Wisdom. We get this riff. Then after a little panned entry, this absolutely nasty version of the same riff, which is much slower. And here's a similar-ish one in Pupil Slicer's Interlocutor, where again it's a chugs and screech mathcore riff where the screeches change in the slower version. So those are all pretty clear examples, and there are a few overarching similarities between them. They're all pretty much the same riff, suddenly coming back slower, normally at or near the end of the song, normally after a slight pause or break in the texture. Let's say that these are the key features of this trope. And if the examples I've already given have all of those features that I think are important, there are also plenty of examples that have enough of them to make them feel the same, even if they're missing some key feature. The extent to which they count as an example of the same riff but slower isn't black and white. I'd say the next several examples are on the spectrum of this trope, but aren't what I'd show someone first if I was trying to show a perfect example of this trope or trying to explain what this trope is. Here's a very cool one from The Faceless, where it's the same riff, suddenly slower, but not at the end of the song, and it's a very brief section. The same effect of stuff suddenly being heavier, but the fact that it's so quick and that it goes back to the original tempo right after makes it feel more agile and kind of like witty. A common thing is to have all of the main features, but have the slower riff be different enough from everything else in the song that I can't quite call it the same riff. Here's a super slimy example from Obituary's swampy masterpiece, Slowly We Rot. We get this slammy riff in the middle of the song. And then a few riffs later, at the end of the song, we get a slower riff that's pretty similar, but the rhythmic pattern and shape just aren't quite the same. It's slower, it's at the end of the song, it comes after a break, and it's serpently super heavy. And if you're not paying close attention, it feels exactly the same as the clearer examples of this trope. I think it's safe to say that this riff is accomplishing the same sort of musical thing as the other examples, and maybe it even was setting the template for them, because this is the clearest early example that I found when trying to put together this script. Here's another one where everything is clear, but the riff is different, from the excellent Wind Hand. We've been getting basically this riff for most of the song. Then there's a break, and we get this absolutely disgusting slow riff as a kind of outro that lasts almost as long as the main part of the song. Different riff, but I don't think there's any doubt that this is accomplishing the same kind of thing and coming from the same tradition as these other examples. Here's one more where it's a new riff that shows up slower at the end, but everything else fits the trope. Here's a non-metal example that fits all of the criteria, except that the change is gradual rather than sudden, from the end of Palm's Dog Milk, where it's like they pull back the curtain on the anatomy of this wonky 11/16 groove. It's a transformation that's happening to a single riff. It's at the end of the song, there's a little break in the texture, but the slowing down is gradual instead of sudden. And I wouldn't say that this is going for a heavy aesthetic, at least not in the traditional metal sense. We're starting to fade out of what can reasonably be considered an example of this trope. There's a thread in the doom metal subreddit called "When They Bring Back the Nasty Riff But Slower" that has almost no examples that I would count. The top voted suggestion was Sleep's Dopesmoker, but the whole thing about that song/album is that it just plods along at one tempo the whole time, and the riff doesn't really change. It's a great album, but it doesn't ever actually get slower, as you can verify by skimming through it quickly and comparing tempo in all the different parts. Same goes for most of the Doom examples that people suggested. A lot of them are just songs with slow riffs that are already heavy, but I think the thing in defining the same riff but slower thing is the concept not of slowness, but of slowerness. It's the feeling of the transformation itself that feels especially heavy, I think. There were also a few examples where you get the same riff at the same tempo, but it's slower than what had just come before. That happens, for example, in Black Sabbath's Lord of This World. And in Sleep's Dragonaut. And there are also a few examples where you get a slower riff somewhere in the song, but it's not near the end, and it's not a slower version of a riff we already got. That's what happens, for example, in Neurosis's The Door. When you're trying to do music theory, you have to be very precise about what you're hearing. From that perspective, it's not super helpful to just say that anything that has a slowish riff somewhere in it is an example of this trope. And this is something that, as a younger person, I got very frustrated with about how people talk about music on the internet. People will just say stuff that is blatantly not true, and nobody can or will fact check them. Of course, there's plenty about music that is subjective that's interesting to talk about, but there are some objective things that you can absolutely get wrong, like saying that a riff shows up in a slower version when it's at exactly the same tempo. Of course, there are plenty of people who say interesting things about music on the internet, but I've grown up, thankfully, and from a listening to music perspective, I think it's truer to experience to realize that even riffs that might not really fit many of the criteria I outlined might be evoking the same sort of thing. And it might be more interesting to look at why people are putting these songs up on this list that I can't really see why they think they're an example of this trope. Or maybe it's that people kind of have it backwards, and it's more that this trope is a way of making music feel heavy, so anything that feels heavy might be mistaken for this trope. Either way, tropes are complicated and fuzzy, and it's possible to have a range of how typical any given example is, from being an unambiguous archetype of the trope to being only peripherally related. Same riff but slower is a kind of simple thing to do, but I think that when it's done right and maybe used sparingly, it can be absolutely crushing. It can make you feel like you're suddenly moving through water or molasses instead of air. Everything is heavier, slower, sometimes dreamlike, like you're in an alternate world. And I think it's also a distinctively metal thing, so that's cool if you think metal's cool. I'm sure you all can hit me with some more great examples of this, and I'm sure I've even missed some classic ones. I was expecting to be able to rustle up more Doom and old school death metal examples in particular, but that's what the comments are for. Throw some more examples down there, preferably with a link and a timestamp, and if they're good, I'll add them to the pinned comment and give you credit. Keep it slow, sports fans. See ya.